her life to aid her father's freedom. May Allah hasten Uncle Munir's release. Ameen. Our next speaker today is Cyrus McGoldrick, a Muslim community campaigner. Born in the US, worked for various different organizations. I'll let Cyrus' speech do the talking.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Salatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah. Sisters and brothers, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Peace be upon all of you. Thank you all for being here. Really, it is an honor and a pleasure, to share space with you all, to see young people taking these issues seriously and being a part of this, even as you are students. This event, subhanAllah, I hope that I can be useful. I have to begin by thanking my co-panelists here, and especially our sister Zuleika. I don't know how you could listen to what she just said, to hear what our sister just said, and not take very seriously the challenge that we have in front of us, and not really reevaluate your life, and how we spend our time, how we give ourselves direction, without taking this into account, without understanding the urgency of what we have in front of us. And so I pray that we can be useful, all of us, that we can unite here, and of course reunite in the next as well. I suppose that to contribute, I hope that I can provide some context and perhaps by doing so some direction forward. I was in high school on 9/11, and immediately after, and literally the days after, of course, in the US, we saw an immediate escalation. And I use that word intentionally: Islamophobia, anti-Muslim bigotry, whatever you want to call it, racism, and especially state tactics, state violence, against minority communities and against Muslims in particular. It did not begin on 9/11, but it did escalate. First, it was the roundups, especially of immigrants, of so-called dissidents. It was mass surveillance regimes being put into place. It was political prosecutions beginning, and our brother Munir's case is a classic example. But they began even before that with leaders of charities, leaders of organizations, and we could talk some more about these cases. And of course, most obviously, it was the wars overseas. Afghanistan, Iraq. Now we have war fronts in Pakistan and Somalia and Libya and Yemen. The American wars, the lists grow and grow. I want to step back a little bit further than that even though, so that we can, one, understand the roots of what we're dealing with. Two, so that we can be more effective with that knowledge, inshallah. That we can be more effective in creating a vision moving forward. And finally, with that vision, perhaps also being that it will allow us to be optimistic and understand that our purpose is to work, and that this challenge in front of us is an opportunity. It's not just, we're not here to depress each other and to leave here feeling like we have no chance here and that we're screwed until the Mahdi comes. That's not really what this means. We are here, as both my brother and sister said, we are here to work, to inspire each other to move forward in this work, and this is why we're at a university. This is why we're in Ireland, is to build on an important history of resistance, on a culture of resistance, and so that we can connect the dots and really move forward with a clear vision that is principled and that is productive. And Carrie, we were joking about how far back in history we're going to dig. I'm not going to go back as far as the Magna Carta. I was thinking myself of 1492 Spain. And I choose this date for two reasons. For an American audience, if you ask them what happened in 1492, there's always someone's going to raise their hand and say, "Oh, Christopher Columbus discovered America." And I'm like, discovered? Discovered America? What did he discover? There were people living there already. But this is how it's taught in the American schools. But also in 1492, and this is not coincidence but causative, that immediately before this, the Muslims and Jews, and also Unitarian Christians, were expelled from the Iberian Peninsula. Moving forward from then, there was a policy of convert to Christianity, or to Catholicism in particular, leave if you can, or die. And with this policy and with this cultural line being drawn, we see a European concept of whiteness, of Europeanness, being determined in terms of an other, especially in terms of an Islamic other, in the case of Spain, an African Muslim other, darkness being as opposed to whiteness. Now, of course, it's not that simple, because the Irish themselves were not considered white by the British colonizers of this land. But the logic therein is something which is thorough and continues on to this day. We see also, to tie this to the American project, the native people of North and South America were first colonized, but were the victims of genocide in a way that we have not seen many other places in the world. The genocide of the natives in America was so thorough, that literally the numbers now, it's shocking, the numbers of native of the First Nations people in the United States, such that compared to Palestine, for example, where of course you have a European occupying population claiming the right to have a state there, there are still enough Palestinians, there are still enough Arabs in the land, and also people of Jewish faith, but people who lived there before, who are able to make a claim against Zionism, against the logic of Zionism. But in the United States, this is almost a moot point. This is merely a theoretical discussion that we have about who has the right to the land, because, like I said, the genocide was so thorough. The enslavement, of course, of Africans and bringing them to North America is part of this, and South America is a part of this. And we have to understand, though, that this logic of settler colonialism, which was practiced in the Americas, but also in Africa and in Asia, Australia was a part of this, and we forget about Australia because it's on the other side of the world, but and Americans were kind of self-centered, I suppose, and so we have to start at home. Not out of selfishness, but also because our government is the source of many problems, and so I begin with in the broadest sense, my government. But we have to understand how this today fits into this project. Throughout these colonial projects, the native people were called savages, were called barbarians, were dehumanized compared to animals. And this is true across the world. And we see the same rhetoric, of course, also being directed at the Irish, that the culture was inferior, the language became criminalized, cultural practices. And this carried on. The British, how do I not understate this? We'll begin with disdain. The British racism and bigotry towards the Irish also carried on to America when the Irish came to America. That the people who had immigrated before the Irish, immediately before the Irish, going back to the first European boats, treated the Irish like animals, absolutely. When even into the 60s, the 1960s, when Kennedy, what's that?
No blacks, no dogs, no Irish.
No blacks, no dogs, no Irish was the sign that you would find on bars, where you would find in workplaces. No Irish need apply. Even into the 1960s, and this was after the period of really full Irish integration into the society, when John F. Kennedy was running for president, his Catholicism, and he was the first Catholic president, probably the first Catholic to run for president, although I want to double check that, but the first Catholic that had a chance at least. This was used against him in the same way, with very similar rhetoric to the way that Muslims are seen today in the United States, that his allegiance was to the Pope, his allegiance was to Rome, that he couldn't really be considered fully an American. His allegiance was not to the nation state, but to his co-religionists. And this is a language that you see used against Muslims, of course, today. Now, I want to connect maybe more specifically, while of course continuing our discussion and our focus on anti-Muslim bigotry, especially in state practice. It's important to highlight as well, and to not just skip past, the importance of the ongoing Irish struggle as well. Now, I'm not the best qualified to speak on it. Like Nadia said, I was born in the United States. I'm of mixed ancestry. My father's family is Irish, my mother's family is Iranian, and I hope to bring these spirits together in a spirit of resistance as well. But the last night, for example, in Dublin, and tomorrow night again, we were blessed to have the company of campaigners from the Irish independence community, from people who are still continuing the struggle to reunite Ireland, to free Ireland from British colonialism. And a couple cases were brought, and I have to admit, I'm embarrassed to admit, how little coverage cases like this get overseas, and I can't speak for the Irish community, but unfortunately these things are forgotten. The first case, or one of the cases which is very more recent, I should say, is the case of the Craig Avid two young men who were arrested in so-called Northern Ireland, charged with the murder of a constable, of basically a glorified police officer, right? And the evidence, I looked into the evidence, surrounding this trial, and even the appeal was sabotaged by state practice. Shocking. The attempt to tie these two men to this case was, the word was used last night, and I could say the evidence bears this out, it was farcical. Farcical. It was so absurd. The evidence, the flimsiness of the evidence tying these two men to this crime. The other case that was mentioned was one which is more local, which happened within the Republic, and this is the case of Seamus Daly, someone who was convicted years ago, I guess, of being a real IRA member, and then years after that conviction, after his time was served, his short sentence was served, they then tried to find him liable to a bombing which had happened in the late 80s, was it? And therefore convicted him of 20-some murders, 29 murders that were connected to this bombing. Just another shocking case, and this is, we see how the logic of imperialism becomes internalized as well, and we turn on each other at the behest of our masters. And this is a very dangerous thing, which we can then bring this to the Muslim world and see many cases that are very similar. I wanted to pick up where it was left off in terms of the U.S., and Kerry's laid the groundwork very importantly. But I want to step back also a few decades again. Because after the European settler colonial project, which became the United States of America, it's sure an offshoot, but they took the new name of a new nation state and couched it in beautiful ideals, which we can claim, but we know that the reality was built on slavery and genocide. They then turned inside to the people who were recently freed, which were black people, African Americans of the slave diaspora. They tied this also to anti-communism, which the communist scare, the Red Scare in the United States, which dominated policy discussion for decades. This isn't a small project, this was decades and decades, and laid the groundwork even for later projects which focused specifically on black communities, and later on the programs that now focus especially on Muslims, but on all dissident communities across the United States. In the 50s, it was BOSS, was the acronym for the program, for the squads that were supposed to go after the communists. Later on, it was COINTELPRO, we were talking about earlier, which was a program specifically mandated to undermine black civil rights movement, black human rights movement in the United States, by any means necessary. Like this was their mandate. There was propaganda that was spread. There were threats that were made. There were provocateurs sent into communities, and people just being framed, for crimes. And there are people that are in jail today who have not seen the light of day since the late '60s and early '70s, and who were put in jail under a program that since has supposedly been outlawed. So supposedly COINTELPRO, there was a review, and people were, they probably weren't fired, they were just moved around to a different office. But these programs, their legacies are still being felt, and these are not just numbers on a page, these are real people, these are people's lives who are affected, families ruined, families destroyed by these policies, and these are things that we're feeling now. And this is what leads directly into, of course, at the end of the Cold War, if it really ended, although some of the logic of it seems to be maintained today, and proxy wars seem to continue. But the logic of this was that an enemy was needed. After the communists were no longer so obviously a threat, and you see this in the movies, even going back a couple decades before, and I would even point perhaps to the Iranian Revolution, where you see now the convenience of having the big, bearded, somewhat brown Muslim man, the Islamic government project, the Islamic Revolution project, becoming the new enemy, new target. Now, the sectarian nature of these things, it's a revolving door of enemies and friends, of course, and people are used against each other. For example, 1979's Iranian government was the enemy, but then the Saudi government quickly continued to be a friend and opposing it. This is a complicated history which we should, in fact, talk more about. But this is where we see the beginning, really, of the Muslim menace, of the Muslim bad guy in the American culture, in the American media. Where in the movies, you go back and watch like some Rambo movies, and you see them, basically the guys with the keffiyeh scars popping up behind walls, and you're shooting them like an arcade game. And this became very common if you go back and look at these movies, and it's still common today, of course. Zero Dark 30, and some of these movies are really no different. But this bred the ground really for a radicalization theory which was mentioned, and Mark Sageman, literally you were reading my mind, man. What these former, and there was another one too, and I forget the other guy's name, Sageman's partner in this. There were two of the...
Michael Schur is another...
Was that the other one?
Yeah, he was...
Both of them were CIA, I think, and then they made a career as consultants.
Michael Schur was FBI.
Oh, okay,
he was
okay.
the head of the Bin Laden unit.
Got it.
But yeah.
These two knuckleheads, someone gave them 6 figures of money. In fact, the New York Police Department in particular, which is often a testing ground. Most of these programs I talked about, BOSS, COINTELPRO, many of them centered in New York because of the opportunity for organizing, community organizing, and the strength of community organizing there. They produced for the New York City Police Department a document called Radicalization in the West. And actually, you can still find it online today. If you Google it, you can find a nice PDF on it. I think it's still on the NYPD's website, actually. Radicalization in the West. And this radicalization that they're talking about specifically, and you could probably guess by the fact that they threw the label "the West" in there, but it was about Muslims. It was about Muslims being radicalized, and they could be American-born, Muslims. It could be your next-door neighbor. But this path, right, this track by which people follow, that they become terrorists, basically. And once you're on this track, of course, you can't get off the track unless you're just arrested and locked up and the key is thrown away from an early point. Now, it's important to note that I think for step 1, there was a 4-step process. The first step was pre-radicalization. And step 4 was, I kid you not, jihadization is the word. Like, I think you can find that word, chapter 4. It's like jihadization is the final step when someone is jihadized. They are ready to fight, And the early stages of this, these are the things that are supposed to clue in a police officer, a detective, an undercover, whatever it is. Some of the signs of this radicalization are things like praying, you mentioned, praying 5 times a day, for example, and especially going to the mosque, God forbid. If you go there for your prayers, then you're probably already a terrorist. Things like frequenting libraries, God forbid you read. Things like quitting smoking. If you quit cigarettes, then you must be, who knows? And for all the money that the New York City spent on anti-smoking campaigns, the fact that at the same time they're criminalizing people for quitting smoking for, say, a religious reason, if that's your belief, then the logic of this falls apart pretty quickly. Things like giving up, what they say, like urban clothing, whatever the hell that means. Things like hip-hop clothing, I think. It was some really terrible terminology that they used in this text. If you give this up for a more Islamic clothing, which of course we know is usually a cultural clothing which is associated with Islam, but someone starts wearing thobes, like the dishtashas more often, or whatever it is, if a woman starts, oh wow, they really don't want me to talk.
Okay,
Are we just standing too still maybe? Is there a sensor for this? Oh, there we go, okay. I must have pressed the button, yeah, yeah. NSA follows us everywhere, yeah. So very good. Where was I? I think I was radicalizing you guys, right? You guys jihadized yet? Yeah. Anyway, you get the idea. These were the... Yeah, we have a lot of them. We have a lot of beards in here and some non-smokers. So I'm sure we're on the track. And I'm sure we're being watched, and of course this is part of our reality. We understand this as well. I mean, that's why we're filming it and putting it online for everyone to understand what we're talking about. Like, you can get it from us. Like, we're happy to tell you. You get I'm sure you all understand this theory is ridiculous. It's been debunked. Immediately after this document came out in 2006, all the civil rights groups in Muslim organizations and civil rights groups came together around this, tried to revise it, offered, even went down to like taking a red pen to it and trying to offer a different one to the NYPD. And they were like, yeah, thanks. And then they added 1 page to the back of the PDF, and I think that's on the PDF that you can find online. And it says, well, this is what the Muslims think. But we don't really care about that. They didn't change the document at all. It should have been no surprise that about 4 years later, the Associated Press has leaked a number of documents detailing a program, a surveillance program, a spy program, not just technological surveillance, but a spy program that they were trained on by the CIA. And the CIA is not legally allowed to spy on Americans, so they trained the NYPD to do it, and they deputized a couple CIA agents to accompany the NYPD on this project. This work is what finally woke up a lot of Muslims who, in the years since 9/11, had either out of fear or out of apathy just really went to sleep, really left the work, and I think finally again it felt personal. And it's important, and the reason I include that is to remind you and myself first and foremost, of course, that we can't wait for it to become personal to start to deal with these issues when we find them, to really root them out. If you feel safe, if you feel comfortable, that's good. If your zone, if your neighborhood is liberated, that's great. That's a beautiful thing. And there's a reason that we're here in Ireland. Like I said, even though there are cases that continue, even though the Irish government has taken problematic stances at the very least, I'll speak mildly. At the same time, the presence in this room is a testament, of course, to the opportunity that we have to do some of the work that we need to do. And that's great. But now you have to look beyond. Now we have to understand and be wary. We have to be on defense to make sure these don't come in, and also go on offense to make sure that we're building towards a principled vision. There are a number of cases, some of which were mentioned. I would be remiss to leave this podium without mentioning the names of some of these important cases of the people who are still in prison today. I'm thinking specifically of the Holy Land 5. The Holy Land Foundation was a very important charity, an international charity, with the best reputation, did the most important work, and